I stood in the front pew staring at the polished mahogany casket holding my husband. He was a retired Army colonel who gave his best years to his country and his entire heart to our marriage. Before the choir even finished singing the final hymn, my mother-in-law leaned in close so her breath brushed against my cheek. "I want the estate, the family logistics business, and every single account he left behind," she whispered. My attorney had explicitly warned me to fight her with everything I had. Instead, I looked directly into her greedy eyes and said, "Let her have it all." The entire congregation would soon think I had lost my mind for giving away a multi-million-dollar empire to a woman who despised me. But when the judge finally closed the probate file and asked my mother-in-law one simple question, her smug smile completely vanished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old and I work as a senior financial strategist. In my profession, I deal in risk assessment, asset protection, and long-term leverage. I am trained to look at the math behind the curtain. I do not deal in messy emotional outbursts because emotions make you blind to the trap being set right under your feet. The scent of white lilies and polished floor wax was heavy in the air of the church sanctuary. Jamal had been my partner, my fierce protector, and my greatest love. Losing him to sudden heart failure just a few weeks after his military retirement had shattered my world in the privacy of our home. But out here in public, especially today, I wore my composure like impenetrable armor. The soft organ music was still playing as the mourners began to respectfully file out to pay their respects to the family. That was the exact moment Beatrice decided to make her move. Beatrice was Jamal's mother. She was a woman whose entire identity was completely wrapped up in the perception of generational wealth and high society status within our local African American community. She wore a custom-tailored black mourning dress that looked far more suited for an exclusive charity gala than a funeral service. She did not offer me a warm hug. She did not ask how I was holding up after losing the man I had slept next to for over 10 years. She did not shed a single genuine tear for her eldest son. Instead, she cornered me near the vestibule, deliberately blocking my path to the receiving line where Jamal's military colleagues were waiting. "Jamal always said the business belonged in the family, Kendra," she stated. Her voice was dripping with artificial authority and a coldness that chilled the surrounding air. "I expect the master keys to the primary estate and the master access codes to the military logistics company turned over to me by tomorrow morning. You understand that this is the only proper way to honor his legacy." I looked at her while studying the cold calculation in her eyes. As a financial strategist, I evaluate every threat from every possible angle before making a single move. Beatrice was trying to execute a hostile takeover while she assumed I was blinded by crippling grief. The logistics company Jamal built was a massive operation. It handled highly lucrative government supply chains and military transport contracts across the entire region. It was an empire built on endless hours of hard work and strategic planning, and Beatrice desperately wanted to sit on the throne without having put in a single day of actual labor. She was not acting alone in this ambush. Flanking her like eager vultures waiting for a meal were Terrence and Chloe. Terrence was Jamal's younger brother. He was 32 years old, perpetually unemployed, and entirely funded by the very company he now wanted to steal from me. Terrence had never worked a hard day in his life. He much preferred to play the role of a misunderstood entrepreneur while constantly draining Beatrice's personal accounts to fund his failed ventures. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was Terrence's white wife. She was a woman whose pure entitlement took up all the oxygen in any room she entered. Chloe stepped forward while adjusting the brim of her oversized black designer hat. I knew for an absolute fact that her hat was purchased using the logistics company credit card that Terrence had secretly maxed out the previous month. A condescending smirk played on her lips as she looked me up and down. "Let us be realistic, Kendra," she whispered loudly enough for the nearby military officers to turn their heads. You were always just a temporary fixture in this family. Jamal loved you, sure, but legacy is for blood. You should start packing your bags tonight. I already have contractors lined up to redecorate the primary estate. That dark modern aesthetic you chose never really fit the neighborhood anyway. The audacity of her statement was breathtaking. Here I was, standing mere feet away from my husband's casket, and my sister-in-law was gleefully discussing paint swatches for my master bedroom. This was the deeply toxic ecosystem Jamal had spent his entire adult life shielding me from. Beatrice constantly enabled Terrence's massive incompetence while deliberately elevating Chloe above me. Beatrice did this simply because Chloe played the submissive dependent daughter-in-law role that Beatrice deeply craved. Beatrice absolutely hated that I was a dark-skinned, self-made woman with my own highly successful career and my own money. She could not control me with financial threats or social pressure, so she constantly sought to break my spirit instead. For years, I had endured their relentless microaggressions. Beatrice would make backhanded compliments about my natural hair while praising Chloe's standard appearance. Chloe would openly brag about her lavish vacations at family dinners while looking at me with pure pity because I chose to work long hours building my financial portfolio. They thought my dedication to my career was a sign of emotional coldness. They never understood that my career gave me the power to walk away from anyone who disrespected me. The three of them stood there in the church lobby, forming a solid wall of hostility. They were waiting for me to crack under the pressure. They wanted a dramatic scene. They wanted me to scream and cry and look like the angry, unstable widow in front of Jamal's highly decorated military colleagues. They wanted to use my grief as tangible proof that I was mentally unfit to manage his massive estate. I looked at Terrence, who was proudly puffing out his chest as if he had already won the lottery. I looked at Chloe, who was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Then I looked directly at Beatrice. I reached slowly into my designer leather tote bag. My movements were deliberate and completely steady. I bypassed the packages of tissues and pulled out the heavy brass ring holding the spare master keys to the primary estate. I held the keys out in the open air between us. Beatrice's eyes widened in genuine shock. She clearly expected a massive legal fight right there in the vestibule, but her surprise was quickly replaced by a greedy, triumphant gleam washing over her perfectly made-up face. She snatched the keys from my hands so fast you would think I might suddenly change my mind. I did not shed a single tear in front of them. I did not beg them to respect my marriage or reconsider their cruel demands. I did not argue about my legal rights as a surviving spouse. I simply nodded, gracefully stepped around their little blockade, and walked out the heavy wooden doors of the church into the bright afternoon sun. The confusion on their faces was palpable as I walked away. But I knew their overwhelming arrogance would quickly override any lingering suspicion they might have about my easy surrender. They truly thought they had won the war because I handed over a piece of metal. But I do not fight battles over brick and mortar. I fight tactical wars over ledgers, corporate liabilities, and federal tax codes. They had absolutely no idea what was actually waiting for them inside that massive house and within the books of that logistics company. They thought they had just secured a lifetime of generational wealth and endless luxury. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between outward appearances and actual financial reality. My driver was waiting at the curb in a sleek black sedan. I slid into the back seat and gave him an address no one in my husband's family knew existed. 6 months ago, anticipating the storm that would eventually break, I purchased a luxury townhouse in a gated community across the city. I bought it under a blind LLC, utilizing multiple layers of corporate protection. It was my sanctuary and my command center. The drive took 45 minutes, giving me ample time to transition from a grieving widow back into a financial strategist. As the car pulled up to the modern glass and steel structure, I felt the familiar, cool logic settle over my mind. Jamal had loved this place. He called it our bunker. We spent our last few weekends here drinking expensive bourbon and organizing the massive amount of digital evidence required to secure my future. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet foyer. Dropping my designer bag on the pristine marble counter, I walked straight to my home office. The space was dominated by a large mahogany desk and 3 high-resolution monitors. I powered on the system and unlocked my encrypted drive. While the files loaded, I picked up my personal cell phone and opened a specific folder labeled Beatrice. I am not the kind of woman who relies on memory when dealing with toxic people. I rely on receipts. I tapped the screen and pressed play on a voicemail from exactly 8 months ago. Kendra, it is Beatrice. The voice echoed through my quiet office, dripping with that fake aristocratic tone she carefully practiced. I am looking at the guest list for the country club gala next week. I need you to wear something subdued. Nothing too flashy, and please try to do something elegant with your hair. We are sitting with the board of directors, and you know how they value a certain aesthetic. Also, I spoke to Jamal about your little financial consulting business. It is cute that you like to play with numbers, but he really needs a wife who focuses on supporting his legacy. A traditional woman. Call me back. I listened to her condescending words without a single flinch. That voicemail perfectly encapsulated 20 years of her deep-seated insecurities. Beatrice was an African-American woman obsessed with proximity to whiteness and old money. She worshipped the ground Chloe walked on simply because Chloe was a white woman who played the role of a submissive, dependent daughter-in-law. Chloe fit perfectly into the country club aesthetic Beatrice desperately craved. I, on the other hand, was everything Beatrice hated. I am a proud, dark-skinned African-American woman who built a highly lucrative career from scratch. I did not inherit a single dime. I earned my degrees through grueling late-night study sessions, and I built my client roster by being the smartest person in any boardroom I entered. Beatrice despised the fact that she could not control me with her purse strings. She hated that Jamal looked at my ambition with pure admiration instead of intimidation. I pressed play on the next voicemail saved from a Tuesday evening 4 months prior. Kendra, you need to tell Jamal to authorize the transfer for Terrence's new startup. Beatrice's voice was shrill and frantic on this recording. Terrence needs that $200,000 by Friday or he loses the commercial lease. You are poisoning my son against his own blood. You think just because you make a decent salary, you can dictate how our family money is spent. You are isolating him. You need to remember your place in this hierarchy. My place. I smiled at the monitor. I knew my place perfectly well. My place was analyzing the corporate accounts and realizing that Terrence was not starting a new business. Terrence was paying off massive gambling debts and covering up severe financial discrepancies in the logistics company records. When I showed Jamal the forensic accounting proof of his brother's massive incompetence, it nearly broke his heart. But Jamal was a military man. He understood duty, and he understood when a tactical retreat was necessary for survival. I closed the audio files and opened the email thread with my attorney, Elias. Elias was a brilliant legal mind, sharp as a razor, and incredibly loyal to Jamal and me. He had been working around the clock since Jamal's passing to ensure the estate transitions went smoothly. But he was about to face a massive headache. I drafted a quick, secure message to him. Elias, Beatrice took the bait. She demanded the keys to the main estate and the logistics company at the funeral. I handed them over without a fight. Terrence and Chloe are with her. I need to meet you at your office tomorrow morning at 9. We need to prepare for a hostile move regarding the will. I hit send and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I closed my eyes and let the absolute silence of the townhouse wash over me. The grief of losing Jamal was a heavy physical ache in my chest, but I refused to let it paralyze me. Jamal had spent his final months making sure I would never be a victim to his family's greed. He had meticulously laid out the groundwork. Now it was my job to execute the plan flawlessly. My phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was a text message from Elias. Confirmed. See you at 9. Be ready for anything, Kendra. They have retained counsel. I locked the screen and poured myself a small glass of water. They had retained counsel. Of course they had. Beatrice was likely planning a massive legal strike, assuming I would be too busy planning a memorial service to notice her maneuvering. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. But she did not realize we were not even playing the same game. I was writing the rules of the board. Tomorrow morning at the lawyer's office, she would try to back me into a corner. She would try to use her social power and her fabricated authority to strip me of everything Jamal and I had built together. I took a slow, deliberate breath and prepared myself for the ambush. I would let them scream. I would let them make their demands. And then I would let them hang themselves with their own limitless greed. I stepped out of the glass elevator and onto the top floor of Sterling and Vance. The law firm commanded a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, but my focus was entirely on the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hallway. Elias was waiting for me in the main conference room. Elias was a brilliant corporate attorney. He had known Jamal since their undergraduate days at Morehouse College, and he handled all our complex financial structuring. He was sharp, loyal, and fiercely protective of Jamal's legacy. When I walked into the room, Elias stood up. He did not offer empty platitudes or pitying looks. He knew exactly how I operated. We took our seats at the massive conference table, and he immediately opened the heavy leather binder containing Jamal's final estate plans. "Kendra, we need to process the primary estate transfers today," Elias said, his tone strictly business. "The logistics company requires immediate operational continuity. We need to formalize your controlling shares so the Department of Defense contracts do not face any disruption." I nodded, pulling a sleek silver pen from my bag. I was fully prepared to sign the necessary documents to keep the empire running. Before the pen even touched the paper, the heavy oak doors of the conference room violently swung open. There was no knock. The firm's receptionist hovered in the doorway looking frantic and apologetic, but she was easily shoved aside. Beatrice marched into the room like a conquering general. Terrence and Chloe were right on her heels, moving like eager foot soldiers ready to loot a captured city. The disruption of a formal legal setting did not bother Beatrice in the slightest. She operated under the delusion that her social status granted her unlimited access to any room she demanded to enter. Elias stood up immediately. His jaw was clenched tight. "Beatrice, this is a private legal meeting," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "The reading of the will for the extended family is scheduled for next week. You need to leave my office right now." Beatrice completely ignored him. She walked straight up to the mahogany table, pulling out a chair directly across from me. She sat down, crossing her legs with slow, deliberate arrogance. Terrence puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating in a suit that was clearly a size too small. "You need to sit down," Elias Terrence sneered. "The real family is handling things now. You work for us." Chloe stood behind Beatrice, holding a designer iced coffee. She took a loud sip and rolled her eyes at the formal surroundings. "We are just here to fix a little administrative error," Chloe announced. Her voice carried that specific tone of weaponized entitlement. Jamal never meant for an outsider to handle generational wealth. "We are just correcting his paperwork." Elias reached for his desk phone to call security, but I raised my hand. I extended one finger, signaling him to stop. I did not want them thrown out. I wanted to see exactly what kind of trap they thought they were setting. "Let them speak, Elias," I said softly. My voice was completely steady. "I want to see what they brought us." Beatrice smiled. It was a cold, venomous expression. She opened her pristine leather portfolio. She did not just place the document on the table, she slammed it down. The sharp smack of paper against polished wood echoed in the quiet room. "There will be no transfer of the estate to you, Kendra," Beatrice announced. Her voice was dripping with absolute triumph. My son came to his senses before he passed. He realized his legacy belonged to his mother and his brother, not to a woman who cared more about her personal bank accounts than building a traditional family. Elias snatched the paper off the table. I watched his eyes scan the text. His professional composure cracked for a split second, replaced by pure, unadulterated disgust. He scoffed and tossed the paper toward me. I looked down at the document. It was a single sheet of standard hotel stationery. Written in blue ink was a hastily scribbled paragraph stating that Jamal revoked his previous ironclad will. The sloppy handwriting claimed he was leaving the primary residence and the entirety of the logistics company to his mother, Beatrice. At the bottom of the page was a signature that vaguely resembled Jamal's name. Elias laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This is a joke, Beatrice. A handwritten codicil on hotel letterhead. The signature is a blatant, sloppy forgery. You are committing felony fraud right in front of an officer of the court. This piece of garbage would not hold up in a mock trial, let alone a federal probate court. Beatrice did not flinch. She had anticipated this exact pushback. It is a perfectly legal document, she said smoothly. It was witnessed and signed properly. Terence stepped forward, puffing his chest out further. Chloe and I witnessed Jamal sign it, he declared proudly. It was during a family dinner 2 weeks before he died. He pulled us aside and said he wanted to make things right. He said he trusted his mother to handle the business. I stared at the piece of paper, letting the absolute silence stretch across the room. 2 weeks before Jamal died, he was in the intensive care unit, recovering from his first severe cardiac episode. He was hooked up to 3 different monitors and could barely hold a cup of water, let alone draft a legal amendment to a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. Furthermore, Jamal had not attended a family dinner with Terence and Chloe in over 6 months because he despised their endless requests for money. The sheer audacity of their lie was breathtaking. They were standing in a high-powered corporate law firm attempting to steal a logistics empire with a forged signature on hotel stationery. They thought their sheer confidence and aggressive volume would bully Elias and me into submission. Elias placed both hands on the table, leaning toward Beatrice. I am going to give you exactly 10 seconds to take this fraudulent paper and walk out of my firm, Elias warned. His voice was dangerously low. If you push this, I will personally ensure the district attorney sees this forgery. You are looking at serious federal prison time. We will file an immediate injunction and we will crush you into dust in a courtroom. I watched Terence sweat slightly at the mention of prison time. Chloe shifted her weight, looking nervously at her husband, but Beatrice remained completely anchored in her delusion. She leaned forward, matching Elias's intense posture, but keeping her eyes entirely locked on mine. She was preparing to drop her ultimate threat. Beatrice did not break eye contact. Her smile widened into something truly predatory. You can wave your empty legal threats all you want, Elias, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But we both know the law is only as powerful as the optics behind it. You take this to a judge, and I will make sure the media gets the story first. I watched her carefully. Go on, Beatrice, I challenged softly. Tell me exactly what story you plan to sell. She adjusted her posture, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her designer skirt. I sit on the board of the most prestigious philanthropic organizations in Atlanta. I have the ear of every major investor in your little financial portfolio, Kendra. If you fight me on this, I will personally ensure every single one of your high net worth clients pulls their funding by Friday. I will paint you as the greedy widow who stole a grieving mother's legacy. Your firm will be radioactive. No one in our society circles will do business with you ever again. Chloe chimed in, nodding vigorously. We already have the press releases drafted. We will say you isolated him in his final days. We will say you manipulated his accounts when he was too sick to defend himself. I barely registered Chloe's squawking. My firm was highly resilient. I could easily weather a baseless smear campaign. Beatrice saw the lack of fear in my eyes and immediately pivoted to her real leverage. She played her absolute trump card. And what do you think a messy, highly public probate battle will do to Jamal's military legacy? Beatrice asked. You know how the press works. If we go to war, I will leak fabricated stories about his logistics contracts. I will whisper that his military retirement was actually a forced discharge. I will drag my own son's name through the mud just to watch you drown in the fallout. Are you really prepared to let his honorable record be destroyed just to keep a house and a company? Elias slammed his hands on the desk. His professional restraint completely snapped. You are a monster, Beatrice. You would destroy your own son's legacy just to feed your ego. I am calling the judge right now. I am filing a hostile injunction and a restraining order against all 3 of you. He reached for the heavy receiver on his desk. He was ready to go to war for me. He was ready to protect Jamal's honor with every legal weapon in his considerable arsenal. I looked at Beatrice. She was breathing heavily now, her chest rising and falling with the thrill of her own malice. She was fully prepared to burn everything to the ground. She was absolutely certain she had backed me into an inescapable corner. She did not know I had been building the walls of this corner myself. "Elias," I said. My voice sliced through the tension in the room, cold and absolute. "Put the phone down." Elias froze, his hand hovering over the keypad. "Kendra, what are you doing? We cannot let them get away with this. They are actively extorting you in my office." I reached across the mahogany table and placed my hand firmly over his wrist. I pressed down, forcing him to lower his hand. I locked eyes with my attorney, willing him to trust me. "I need you to stand down, Elias. Do exactly as I say." The silence in the room was deafening. Elias stared at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of panic or coercion. He found none. He slowly withdrew his hand from the phone. I turned my attention back to the other side of the table. Terrence was grinning so hard he looked like he might burst. Chloe was practically bouncing on her expensive heels. Beatrice simply leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms in ultimate victory. She had won. The dark-skinned outsider had finally been put in her place. "I accept the codicil," I stated clearly, ensuring every word was deliberate and legally unambiguous. "If Jamal wanted you to have the primary estate and the logistics company Beatrice, then I will not stand in the way of his final wishes. You can have the house. You can have the business. You can have every single asset listed on that hotel stationery." Elias let out a sharp breath. "Kendra, you are signing away millions. You are handing them the keys to the entire kingdom." I did not break eye contact with my mother-in-law. "Draft the paperwork, Elias. Fast-track the transfer of ownership. Give Beatrice exactly what she is demanding." Beatrice stood up, smoothing her black dress. She looked down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "It is about time you learned how things work in this family, Kendra. You were always just a visitor. Now you are officially dismissed." Terrence grabbed the forged document off the table, holding it like a winning lottery ticket. "Come on, Mom. Let us go check out our new properties. I need to figure out which office is going to be mine." They turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the heavy doors wide open behind them. I listened to the sharp click of Chloe's heels fading down the hallway, accompanied by their loud, celebratory laughter. They thought they had just executed the perfect heist. They thought they had crushed my spirit and stolen my empire. Elias collapsed into his chair, rubbing his temples. He looked completely defeated. "Why did you do that, Kendra? We had them dead to rights. They cannot just walk in here and take everything Jamal built." I watched the empty doorway for a long moment. A slow, genuine smile finally touched my lips. I opened my designer bag and pulled out a secure encrypted flash drive, placing it gently on the polished wood between us. "They did not take anything," Elias said softly. "I just handed them a ticking time bomb. 48 hours. That was exactly how long it took for the vultures to completely descend on the primary estate. They did not even wait for the final probate stamp before they packed up their rented apartment and moved their chaotic lives into the sanctuary Jamal and I had meticulously built." I sat perfectly still in my home office at the secondary townhouse. The dual monitors on my desk served two very different purposes this afternoon. The left screen displayed a complex matrix of offshore trust ledgers and encrypted federal tax documents. The right screen displayed Chloe's highly publicized Instagram Live broadcast. I watched the digital numbers climb in the corner of her video as thousands of her followers tuned in. Chloe was holding her phone high, strutting through the grand foyer of my former home. She was wearing one of Jamal's vintage Morehouse College sweatshirts as an oversized dress. It was a calculated, sick power move designed to project her ultimate victory. In the background, Terrence was shouting orders at a team of expensive movers, treating them with the trademark disrespect of a man who had never actually earned a paycheck. "Welcome to the new legacy estate, you guys." Chloe squealed into the camera, spinning around to show off the two-story vaulted ceilings and the floating glass staircase. "We are finally stepping into our generational wealth. The universe really rewards the people who deserve it." I kept my face entirely impassive. Generational wealth. The phrase sounded absolutely ridiculous coming from her mouth. Jamal had built every single cent of that wealth from the ground up through grueling military deployments and relentless corporate strategy. There was nothing generational about it, but I let her spin her fairy tale to her eager audience. Chloe marched the camera up the stairs and pushed open the double doors to the master bedroom. I had spent 6 months working with a top-tier architect to curate that specific space. It featured custom ebony wood panels, deep emerald accents, and rich textured fabrics that reflected my own personal aesthetic. Chloe turned the camera around, scanning the room with exaggerated disgust. "We are definitely tearing all of this down," she announced to her viewers, running her manicured fingers along the dark wood paneling. "It is way too dark in here. A little too ethnic, you know. We need something brighter, something more classic and refined." The racial microaggression was blatant and completely intentional. She knew I would likely see this. She wanted me to feel erased. She wanted to publicly strip away my identity from the space I had shared with my husband. I did not flinch. I did not feel the familiar burn of anger. I simply moved my mouse to the left monitor and highlighted another row on my spreadsheet, isolating a particularly aggressive federal tax lien attached to the very floorboards she was currently standing on. Chloe moved toward my custom-built vanity. I had deliberately left a few minor personal items behind to make my sudden surrender look authentic and emotionally rushed. There was an old silk scarf, a stack of hardcover financial books, and a decorative ceramic vase. I needed them to believe I had fled in a panic. When you inherit real wealth, you have to clean out the trash first. Chloe laughed, reading the comments flashing across her screen. She dropped the camera angle downward to show a heavy-duty black garbage bag spread open on the floor. She picked up my silk scarf and dangled it in front of the lens. "Completely outdated," she mocked, before dropping it directly into the garbage bag. She did the same with the books, shoving them into the trash with loud, performative sighs. Hearts and fire emojis floated rapidly up the right side of the broadcast as her followers validated her cruelty. Terrence swaggered into the frame holding a heavy crystal decanter he had taken from the downstairs dining room. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, and he was already pouring himself a massive glass of our most expensive scotch. To the real heirs, Terrence toasted, holding his glass up to the camera lens. "We are finally taking back what belongs to the bloodline." Chloe leaned in and kissed his cheek. "Generational wealth, baby," she cheered. I reached out and muted the audio on the right monitor. Their voices were a useless distraction from the highly critical work happening on my left monitor. I shifted my full attention back to the corporate ledgers. I opened the master file for the logistics company and cross-referenced the exact property address Chloe was currently parading around in. The estate was undeniably beautiful. It featured a stunning infinity pool, 6 large bedrooms, and custom imported marble that Jamal and I had picked out in Italy. It also featured a massive hidden balloon payment tied directly to a defaulted corporate loan that Beatrice had just eagerly assumed full liability for when she signed that forged codicil. I engaged a screen recording software and downloaded the entire video of Chloe throwing my things into garbage bags. I saved it directly to a secure legal folder labeled Estate Dominion Evidence. I did this because every display of them legally and physically taking possession of the estate drastically strengthened my legal position. They were establishing undeniable public dominion over the assets. When the IRS and the federal auditors eventually arrived to seize the property, Chloe's arrogant Instagram Live would serve as federally admissible evidence of their eager voluntary occupation. They could not claim ignorance or assert that they were merely holding the property for me. They were broadcasting their ownership to the entire world. I took a slow sip of my own water, watching the muted video play out. Chloe twirled in the center of my former master bedroom, blissfully unaware that she was dancing directly in the middle of a financial minefield. She thought she was humiliating me by throwing a silk scarf into a garbage bag. She had no idea that I was meticulously organizing the digital paperwork that would ensure her entire luxurious lifestyle ended up in the exact same place. Let her have the empty rooms. Let her have the digital validation from strangers. I was busy securing the actual kingdom. Every single item she threw away only cemented the trap tighter around their ankles. The social media eviction was not an insult to me. It was the absolute perfect alibi. The digital alerts chiming on my secondary monitors were sharp and relentless. The secure servers were notifying me of revoked administrator access across multiple corporate platforms. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours after I handed over the keys at the church. Beatrice was not wasting a single second to establish her absolute dominance. My phone vibrated on the polished mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed the name Calvin. Jamal and I had headhunted Calvin from a top-tier aerospace defense firm 3 years ago to serve as our vice president of operations. He was a meticulous, honorable African-American man who was fiercely loyal to Jamal's vision. Now his voice was tight with suppressed rage over the speakerphone. "Kendra, you need to tell me what is going on," Calvin demanded. Beatrice just marched into the executive suite with Terrence and 2 private security guards. She called an emergency all-hands meeting and declared herself the new chief executive officer. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, keeping my breathing perfectly even. "And how did she announce her arrival?" Calvin, I asked. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "She showed up wearing a designer suit that costs more than a forklift transmission, treating a heavy-duty military supply chain firm like it was her personal country club." Terrence is already sitting in Jamal's chair with his feet on the desk, asking the IT department to install a massive flat-screen television for his gaming console. Beatrice's first official act of corporate power was not reviewing the quarterly earnings. It was not checking the status of our highly sensitive active Department of Defense transport contracts. Her first act was a brutal, targeted purge. She wanted to completely erase my influence from the building. To do that, she had to eliminate the competence that Jamal and I had carefully installed. Calvin described the bloodbath playing out in the glass-walled conference room. Beatrice called in the head of corporate compliance, a brilliant woman named Angela. Angela was responsible for ensuring our government invoices met the suffocatingly strict federal standards required to maintain our security clearances. Beatrice fired her on the spot, citing structural redundancies and a need for fresh loyalty. Then she moved to the chief financial officer. She fired him simply because he respectfully requested to see the legal probate documents authorizing her hostile takeover. Beatrice told him that questioning her authority was an act of gross insubordination and had security escort him from the premises. "She is firing everyone who actually knows how to run this empire," Kendra Calvin warned. The panic was finally breaking through his professional exterior. She just handed a box to the lead dispatcher. "Terrence is telling people that he plans to bring in his own team of visionaries to modernize the company. His visionaries are the same lazy friends who bankrupted his luxury sneaker boutique last year." "Are you next on the chopping block, Calvin?" I asked calmly. "She summoned me to Jamal's office in 10 minutes," he confirmed. "I am not going down without a fight. I have half the legal team on standby. Jamal built this place with blood, sweat, and absolute integrity. I am not letting his vain status-obsessed mother burn it to the ground just because she wants to feel powerful." This was the crucial moment. Calvin was a good man, but a good man will easily die on the wrong hill if he does not see the sniper hiding in the trees. "Calvin, listen to me very carefully," I instructed. My voice dropped to a command tone that brooked absolutely no argument. "You are going to walk into that office. You are going to look Beatrice dead in the eye. And when she hands you your termination papers, you are going to take them without a single word of protest." "Kendra, you cannot be serious," Calvin argued. "The military contracts are too important." "Do not worry about the contracts," I cut him off smoothly. "I need you to demand your full severance package, sign the non-disclosure agreement." She pushes across the desk and walk out of that building with your head held high. Do not fight her. Do not call the legal team. Let her fire you. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Calvin was a brilliant strategist in his own right, and he knew me well enough to recognize when I was maneuvering pieces on a much larger board. "You are letting her drive the car off the cliff," Calvin realized slowly. "I am letting her cut the brake lines," I corrected. "Beatrice thinks she is purging my loyalists to secure her throne. What she is actually doing is systematically firing the exact people who were keeping this company legally compliant. She just fired the head of compliance and the chief financial officer." Do you know what happens to a federal military contractor when they operate without certified compliance oversight? The Department of Defense freezes the operating accounts and triggers an immediate federal audit, Calvin whispered. The realization hit him like a freight train. Exactly, I said. Jamal and I spent years installing those brilliant minds to act as guardrails. Beatrice is so blinded by her hatred for me and her obsession with perceived power that she is ripping those guardrails out with her bare hands. I need you completely clear of the blast radius when the federal government comes knocking. I heard Calvin exhale a long, steady breath, the tension completely drained from his voice. I will pack up my desk right now, Kendra. Consider me gone. Take your severance, Calvin. Take a long vacation. I will be in touch when the dust settles. I ended the call and turned my attention back to the corporate ledger on my monitor. The screen flashed as another string of administrator accounts was permanently deleted by Beatrice's new IT directives. She was aggressively locking me out, unaware that I no longer needed to be inside the building to watch it fall. Beatrice's corporate purge was textbook narcissistic leadership. She prioritized blind obedience over basic competence. She believed that wearing a designer suit and demanding respect was the exact same thing as actually earning it. By placing Terrence at the helm of a massive, heavily regulated logistics firm, she was essentially handing a toddler a loaded weapon and telling him it was a toy. They had the company. They had the title. They had the perceived power. But a logistics empire built on strict government oversight cannot run on ego and country club aesthetics. Without Calvin Angela and the rest of the executive team to manage the intricate web of supply chains and federal regulations, the company was flying completely blind into a catastrophic storm. I took a sip of my black coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The purge was a beautiful disaster. Beatrice thought she was erasing my influence from Jamal's legacy. In reality, she was stripping away her only line of defense. There was absolutely no one left in that building to warn her about the massive financial sinkhole opening up directly beneath her expensive heels. Within 48 hours of the executive purge, my read-only access to the secondary tracking software lit up like a distressed switchboard. Terrence officially appointed his inner circle to the highest executive positions in the company. He handed the title of Director of Supply Chain Logistics to a man named Dexter, who had famously bankrupted a luxury sneaker boutique in Buckhead just last year. The position of Chief Financial Officer went to Trey, whose only verifiable qualification was being Terrence's former fraternity brother. The logistics company Jamal built relied on absolute precision. We moved sensitive equipment, critical medical supplies, and heavily regulated raw materials for the Department of Defense. Our daily operations required a meticulous dance of route optimization, federal compliance coding, and high-level security clearances. Terrence and his newly minted executive team treated the corporate dispatch center like a VIP lounge. They rolled into the building at 11 in the morning, ordered expensive catered lunches on the corporate card, and completely ignored the flashing red alerts on the digital dispatch boards. The operational collapse began with a missed delivery window at Fort Moore. A heavily secured convoy of temperature-controlled medical supplies sat idling in a staging lot for 14 straight hours. The drivers were waiting for approval on a specific federal transit manifest. Dexter, operating from a glass-walled office he had entirely redecorated in less than 3 days, had absolutely no idea how to access the secure government portal to authorize the release. He ignored the urgent emails from the dispatchers, assuming it was low-level administrative work that would sort itself out. The military client rejected the shipment entirely. That single failure triggered a massive penalty fine for breach of contract. 2 days later, an entire fleet of commercial transport vehicles was grounded across 3 different state lines. Trey, playing the role of Chief Financial Officer, forgot to authorize the mandatory payments for the commercial fuel accounts. The drivers were stranded at way stations, furiously calling a corporate office where the executives were too busy setting up an indoor golf simulator to answer the phone. The financial bleed was immediate and catastrophic. The Department of Defense does not tolerate delays, and they do not care about a company's internal restructuring. They demand results. When results falter, they freeze payments. Invoices were routinely rejected and kicked back because Angela was no longer there to ensure the defense codes were formatted with absolute accuracy. The inbound cash flow, a massive river of federal capital that Jamal and I had kept flowing steadily for years, completely dried up within 2 short weeks. The company began to hemorrhage money at a staggering rate. Payroll was looming for hundreds of warehouse workers and truck drivers. Supplier invoices were piling up on Trey's desk, unopened and ignored. The operational deficit hit 6 figures and was accelerating rapidly towards 7. A competent leader faced with a sudden operational collapse would halt the supply chains, initiate an emergency audit, and beg the seasoned professionals to return to their posts. Beatrice was not a competent leader. She was a woman whose entire existence revolved around maintaining a flawless social facade. When Terrence casually mentioned the severe cash flow issue during a lavish family dinner, Beatrice did not panic. She did not ask to see the balance sheets. She simply assumed the well of wealth Jamal had built was infinitely deep. To Beatrice, money was just a tool to maintain power and appearances. If the company accounts were running low, she would simply open the spigot a little wider. She reached directly for the corporate credit lines. Jamal and I had secured massive high-limit revolving credit lines to facilitate rapid expansion and cover short-term federal payment gaps. These lines were designed for strategic leverage, not for patching holes in a sinking ship. Beatrice accessed those commercial lines with terrifying ease. Using her freshly minted authority as the chief executive, she authorized a massive blind transfer to cover the impending payroll and silence the angry suppliers. But she did not stop there. The intoxicating feeling of liquid capital at her fingertips was simply too much for her to resist. She treated the commercial credit line like a personal checking account, completely oblivious to the fact that commercial lenders aggressively monitor operational health and debt-to-income ratios. Beatrice pulled an additional $500,000 to fund Chloe's aggressive, tasteless renovations of the primary estate. She justified it as an estate preservation expense. A week later, she authorized a massive 6-figure bonus for Terrence, rewarding him for his hard work during the company transition. Terrence immediately used the corporate funds to purchase a custom-imported sports car, posting a picture of himself leaning against the hood with the caption showcasing his new CEO lifestyle. I watched the digital ledgers update in real time from the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse. Every single time Beatrice authorized a draw against the corporate credit, she added another heavy brick to her own financial tomb. The company was bleeding cash from fundamental operational failures, and Beatrice was aggressively accelerating that bleed with frivolous vanity spending. She was financing a lifestyle of extreme luxury, using high-interest commercial debt tied directly to a company that was actively failing its federal audits. The sheer volume of the debt she was accumulating was staggering. The trap was closing tighter and tighter with every swipe of that corporate card. I took another slow sip of my coffee, perfectly content to sit back in the shadows and let them keep digging the hole. They were blinded by their own unchecked entitlement, entirely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to cave in. It took exactly 3 weeks for Beatrice to realize the commercial credit lines were not an infinite money glitch. The aggressive spending spree had finally triggered automated fraud alerts with the corporate lenders. Terrence had maxed out 2 platinum business cards on luxury watches and exclusive restaurant tabs, while the logistics company defaulted on basic warehouse utility bills. The creditors were starting to call. A rational executive would recognize the imminent collapse and immediately halt all discretionary spending. But Beatrice operated purely on ego. To her, the solution was not to stop spending, but to find another vault to crack open. The legal notification arrived in my secure inbox at precisely 10 in the morning. It was a formal demand letter drafted by Beatrice's overly confident attorney. The document was dripping with unwarranted arrogance. Beatrice was officially demanding the titles and physical keys to the remaining corporate fleet. This fleet was not just standard transport. It included 6 specialized armored vehicles used for high-security government shipments and 3 imported executive sports utility vehicles. More importantly, the letter demanded the immediate and unconditional release of the primary corporate holding accounts. These were the foundational accounts tied directly to the company federal tax identification number. Up until this point, Beatrice and Terrence had been surviving by draining the operational credit lines. But to fully access the core holding accounts, they needed my explicit legal surrender as the surviving spouse. Beatrice wanted absolute, unfettered dominion over every single ledger associated with the company name. She wanted no more delays and no more shared oversight. She wanted total control. My desk phone rang almost the exact second I finished reading the final paragraph of the demand letter. It was Elias. I answered the call and put him on speakerphone. Before I could even say hello, Elias started speaking with a rapid, frantic energy. His professional composure was hanging by a thread. "Kendra, tell me you are looking at the demand letter they just sent over," Elias urged. His voice echoed slightly in his large office. "Beatrice is completely out of her mind. She wants the entire corporate fleet and sole authorization on the primary holding accounts. Do you understand the valuation on those armored transports alone? She is demanding we hand over millions of dollars in hard assets and liquid capital." I leaned back in my chair and listened to the steady hum of my computer tower. "I do see the letter, Elias," I replied. My voice was perfectly calm, creating a stark contrast to his rising panic. "We have to file a blocking motion today," Elias insisted. "I can draft an injunction citing gross mismanagement. I have heard the rumors from the supply chain vendors, Kendra. Terrence is running the logistics operations straight into the ground. They are bleeding cash. If you sign over these primary accounts, Beatrice is going to drain them by the end of the month to cover her shopping habits and her son's gambling debts. You are handing over millions in assets to thieves. We need to lock these accounts down right now and force a federal audit before they destroy everything Jamal built." I let Elias vent his frustration. I completely understood his panic. He was an exceptional attorney and a loyal friend who was desperately trying to protect his client. He saw a hostile takeover of a lucrative empire. He saw a grieving widow being bullied by a toxic mother-in-law. He only saw the surface of the chessboard. He did not see the structural damage deliberately hidden underneath the very squares Beatrice was fighting to conquer. "Elias," I said softly, "I need you to take a deep breath and listen to me." I opened the locked drawer on the right side of my mahogany desk. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy titanium encrypted flash drive. Jamal had placed this exact drive in my hands 3 months before his heart failed. He had looked me in the eye and told me it contained the blueprint to our survival. It was the absolute turning point of the war we were secretly fighting. I plugged the titanium drive into my secure workstation. A black terminal window popped up on my screen demanding a 32-character alphanumeric password. I typed the sequence from memory without missing a single keystroke. The drive unlocked. A massive directory of hidden financial folders populated my screen. These files contained the absolute truth about those primary corporate holding accounts Beatrice wanted so desperately. The folders held detailed records of the massive federal tax liens, the pending Department of Defense indictments, and the catastrophic debt that Terrence had secretly accumulated over the years through his embezzlement schemes. The holding accounts were not a vault of wealth. They were a financial black hole. "Kendra, please," Elias pleaded through the speakerphone. "Give me the green light to fight them. I will not let them take this from you." I smiled, staring at the digital evidence of their impending destruction. They were begging me to hand them the very weapon that would end their entire existence. "You are not going to fight them, Elias," I commanded. My tone was absolute and unwavering. "You are going to give Beatrice exactly what she wants. I want you to draft the transfer paperwork today." Elias went completely silent on the other end of the line. The shock robbed him of his words. I kept my eyes locked on the encrypted files. "Write the transfer documents, Elias," I continued. "But I need you to ensure the language is absolute. I need you to make it airtight. The documents must explicitly state that by assuming sole ownership and unfettered access to these primary holding accounts, Beatrice voluntarily assumes 100% of all associated liabilities, past, present, and future, known and unknown. She wants total control. Make sure she gets the legal responsibility that comes with it." There was a long pause before Elias finally spoke. His voice was laced with deep confusion and a growing sense of realization. You are giving it to them. All of it. I am giving them the rope, Elias, I said. Draft the paperwork. We have a trap to spring. The trap had not been built overnight. It was forged in the quiet, agonizing hours of a Tuesday night 3 months before Jamal took his final breath. I remember the exact sound the rain made as it lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our townhouse. I remember the heavy, suffocating silence that filled my home office. Jamal was sitting in my ergonomic chair. He was wearing his gray sweatpants and a faded army t-shirt. His broad shoulders were slumped forward in a posture of utter defeat. He did not look like a highly decorated military colonel. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to ash. Spread across my polished mahogany desk were hundreds of printed pages, bank statements, internal shipping manifests, Department of Defense compliance logs. Jamal had spent the previous 48 hours locked in this room conducting a brutal microscopic audit of the logistics company after a routine vendor discrepancy caught his attention. I walked into the office carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. I set them down and placed a hand on his shoulder. Jamal rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a breath that sounded like a dry sob. "They are stealing from the federal government, Kendra," he whispered. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "My own mother and my brother. They are running phantom invoices through the primary holding accounts." I pulled up a chair beside him and began scanning the highlighted documents. As a senior financial strategist, my brain processes numbers the way a linguist reads a foreign language. The narrative on the pages was not just illegal, it was catastrophically reckless. Terrence had been exploiting his minimal access to the dispatch software. He was generating fraudulent billing manifests for highly classified military transport routes that never actually occurred. He billed the Department of Defense for ghost fleets, moving non-existent cargo across state lines. The sheer arrogance required to defraud the United States military was staggering, but Terrence was too stupid to understand the magnitude of his crime. Beatrice was the one clearing the path. Using her administrative override as a legacy board member, she bypassed Angela and the compliance team. Beatrice authorized the federal payouts and immediately funneled the cash into a network of poorly constructed shell companies. The money was washing right back into her personal checking accounts and Terrence's gambling portfolios. They had been running this embezzlement scheme for nearly 4 years. The numbers glared at me from the bright white paper. It was not a small leak. They had siphoned millions of dollars in federal capital. Jamal pointed to a specific federal tax document at the bottom of the pile. "And it gets worse," he said. His voice hardened, transitioning from heartbreak to raw anger. "Because they are pulling the capital through phantom logistics routes, they are creating massive taxable events on the corporate ledger, but they are not reserving the cash to pay the corporate taxes. They are spending it as fast as they steal it. The primary holding accounts are currently sitting on over $6 million in unpaid federal tax liens." My blood ran completely cold. The Department of Defense does not operate like a collection agency. When they uncover procurement fraud, they do not send polite warning letters. They send heavily armed federal agents to kick down your door at dawn. They freeze every single asset attached to your social security number. They seek maximum federal prison sentences. Jamal had built his entire career on absolute integrity. He bled for his country. He built a logistics empire to secure our future. And his own mother was using his honorable name as a shield to commit federal crimes. Beatrice and Terrence were perfectly willing to let Jamal take the fall. As the founder and primary stakeholder, Jamal would be the first person the federal prosecutors targeted. They were risking his freedom and my professional licenses just to fund their designer wardrobes and luxury cars. I looked at my husband. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. Beatrice had not just stolen money. She had destroyed the foundational trust between a mother and her son. "We have to freeze the accounts," I stated, immediately shifting into crisis management mode. "We need to hire outside defense counsel tomorrow morning. We will self-report to the Inspector General and turn over these documents. We can throw Beatrice and Terrence to the wolves and plea deal the corporate entity." Jamal shook his head. He reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "If we self-report, the feds will still freeze the entire corporate structure pending a multi-year investigation," he explained. The logistics company will collapse under the audit. Every legitimate employee will lose their job. And because we are married, they will freeze your personal accounts too, Kendra. Your financial consulting firm will be dragged into the investigation. I will not let my family's toxic greed destroy the empire you built for yourself. I stared at him, realizing the terrifying scope of his words. The blast radius of Beatrice's crime was massive. If we triggered the alarm while we were still inside the building, the explosion would take us down with them. So what do we do? I asked. Jamal sat up straight. The defeated sun was gone. The tactical military commander returned to his eyes. We do what we always do when the position is compromised, he said firmly. We execute a strategic withdrawal. We separate our clean assets from their toxic mess. We build an impenetrable fortress for you, and we leave the burning building to the people who started the fire. He pulled a blank legal pad toward him and grabbed a pen. He began mapping out a financial extraction plan so brilliant it left me speechless. Jamal knew his heart condition was worsening. He knew he might not live to see the fallout of the federal audit. His only mission in those final months was to ensure that when the government finally dropped the hammer, his wife would be standing safely behind bulletproof glass. He looked up from the legal pad, his gaze locking onto mine with fierce, unwavering protection. We are going to let Beatrice think she is entitled to the throne Jamal promised, and when she finally takes it, she is going to inherit a guillotine. The very next morning, we transitioned from a married couple facing a tragedy into a highly coordinated tactical unit. There was absolutely no time for tears and no room for hesitation. Jamal's heart condition was a ticking clock, and the federal government was an inevitable storm gathering on the horizon. I am a senior financial strategist. I build impenetrable wealth fortresses for high-net-worth clients every single day. But building one for my own husband while knowing his body was actively failing him was the most agonizing campaign of my entire life. We transformed my home office into a war room. We had to surgically separate the infected financial tissue from the healthy organs. The logistics company was completely radioactive, contaminated by Beatrice and Terrence and their reckless federal tax fraud. But Jamal had built significant personal wealth, entirely independent of that family business. He had a lucrative portfolio of commercial real estate he purchased before Terrence ever touched a corporate ledger. He had aggressive private stock dividends. He had his accumulated military pension and independent private equity investments. Every single clean, untainted dollar had to be isolated, stripped of its connection to the logistics empire, and moved completely out of reach. I immediately contacted my most trusted international legal associates. We bypassed standard domestic accounts entirely. I utilized my highest-level connections to establish an irrevocable asset protection trust based in Nevis. For a financial strategist dealing with aggressive domestic liabilities, Nevis is the ultimate fortress. They have the most impenetrable trust and privacy laws on the planet. Once a dollar crosses their borders and enters an irrevocable trust, it becomes legally dead to domestic civil litigation and incredibly difficult for federal auditors to touch if the source funds were legitimately earned. By making the trust explicitly irrevocable, Jamal had to legally surrender all ownership of his own clean wealth. He could not be a beneficiary, and he could not retain any control over the assets. He drafted the formation documents naming me as the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee. He was actively stripping himself of his life savings and placing absolute total control entirely in my hands. He did this without a single second of hesitation. His only goal was to ensure that when the federal indictments finally came raining down on his mother and brother, I would be standing safe behind bulletproof glass. It took us 3 weeks of relentless, grueling work. We operated through the dead of night, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my multiple computer monitors. I watched my husband consume black coffee and heavy heart medication in equal measure. His skin took on a terrifying gray pallor and his breathing grew shallower with every passing day. I begged him to rest, to let me handle the heavy lifting. He refused. He pushed through the agonizing physical pain because his fierce need to protect me was infinitely stronger than his failing body. We aggressively liquidated his clean real estate portfolios, selling them off-market to private buyers for rapid cash acquisitions. We cashed out the independent stocks, paying the heavy capital gains penalties, up front, just to sanitize the money. We wired millions of dollars in clean capital across the globe in a series of highly complex, perfectly legal corporate transfers. Every single wire transfer was triple-checked, verified, and scrubbed of any digital connection to the logistics company accounts. While we funneled the clean money offshore, we had to simultaneously ensure the toxic assets remained perfectly intact for Beatrice. Jamal executed a masterful legal maneuver regarding the logistics company. He formally resigned his position as the primary financial guarantor for all the corporate commercial credit lines. He filed medical documentation citing his rapidly declining health as the official reason for stepping down. This maneuver was the ultimate Trojan horse for the logistics company to keep operating and for Beatrice to keep funding her lavish lifestyle. The commercial banks required a new primary guarantor. Beatrice aggressively signed the new banking documents, assuming she was simply taking more authoritative control over the empire. Her ego was so massive she did not even consult a financial advisor before putting her pen to the paper. She had absolutely no idea that by signing those specific guarantor forms, she was assuming total personal liability for the millions in fraudulent debt she and Terrence were actively creating. Jamal quietly stepped off the tracks and let Beatrice stand directly in front of the speeding train. The night the final offshore wire transfer officially cleared the Nevis Trust account was the exact same night Jamal suffered his second and final massive cardiac event. I remember the precise moment the encrypted confirmation email hit my secure inbox. The offshore fortress was completely sealed and fully funded with millions of dollars in untouchable assets. I turned my chair to tell my husband that the war was won. He looked at the computer screen and read the confirmation. He smiled at me, a smile of pure absolute relief, and then he collapsed onto the hardwood floor. I rode with him in the back of the screaming ambulance, clutching his hand as the paramedics fought to keep his heart beating. Even then, in the chaotic, fluorescent light of the emergency room, his brilliant tactical mind was focused entirely on the strategy. When the doctors finally gave us a few moments alone, he pulled me close. His voice was a weak, raspy whisper, but his command was absolute. He told me to let Beatrice take the logistics company. He told me to let Chloe parade around the primary estate. He ordered me to play the role of the grieving, defeated widow. He knew his mother's greed would blind her to the trap. He made me promise to hand over the keys and walk away without shedding a single tear in their presence. I kissed his forehead and made that promise. I promised him I would let them claim their toxic throne. The offshore fortress was impenetrable. The clean assets were perfectly safe. Now all I had to do was stand back and let Beatrice eagerly claim the poisoned chalice. The week following Jamal's funeral was a masterclass in aggressive restraint. While Beatrice and Chloe paraded around the primary estate, acting like newly crowned royalty, I sat in my secure townhouse reviewing the final reports from my independent forensic accountants. I had hired a team of former federal auditors to map out the exact blast radius of the crater Beatrice had dug for herself. The documents they delivered to my encrypted server painted a picture so financially catastrophic, it almost looked like a work of fiction. The logistics empire that Beatrice believed would fund her high society lifestyle for the next 3 decades was entirely hollow. It was a beautiful, glittering facade built directly over a massive financial fault line. The forensic audit confirmed my worst suspicions and then amplified them by a factor of 10. The primary holding accounts were completely drained of legitimate operating capital. In their place sat a staggering $6.2 million in active federal tax liens. Beatrice had spent years treating the corporate revenue streams like her personal slush fund. Every time Terrence generated a phantom logistics route to cover his gambling debts, they triggered a massive taxable event. They billed the Department of Defense for services never rendered, collected the federal payouts, and immediately siphoned the cash into their poorly constructed shell companies. But they never paid the corporate taxes on that stolen revenue. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your country club memberships or your designer morning clothes. They care about their ledger, and their ledger indicated that the logistics company owed them over $6 million in back taxes, penalties, and compounding interest. But the tax liens were only the first drop of poison in the chalice Beatrice was so eager to drink from. The true lethal blow was hidden deep within the classified federal procurement portals. When you defraud the United States military, you do not just face financial ruin. You face the full, unbridled wrath of the federal justice system. My forensic team utilized their specialized government clearances to uncover the secondary threat. The Department of Defense had already flagged the company for severe procurement fraud. There were secret federal indictments currently pending against the executive leadership of the logistics company. Federal prosecutors were quietly building a massive criminal case under the False Claims Act. They had undercover agents actively tracking the phantom routes, monitoring the fraudulent invoices, and documenting every single wire transfer Beatrice authorized. The government was simply waiting for the probate dust to settle before dropping the hammer. They needed to know exactly whose name was on the final dotted line as the sole owner and primary shareholder of the corrupt entity before they executed the arrest warrants. This was the brilliant, lethal elegance of Jamal's final strategy. He knew the federal indictments were sealed and pending. He knew the tax liens were quietly attaching themselves to every single physical asset bearing the company name. That included the sprawling primary estate that Chloe was currently redecorating with such enthusiastic entitlement. The beautiful 6-bedroom mansion with the infinity pool and the custom-imported Italian marble was heavily leveraged against the corporate credit lines. It was legally entangled with the logistics company's operational assets. When the IRS officially executed their seizure orders to satisfy the $6.2 million debt, that house would be the very first asset they liquidated. Chloe was not standing in a legacy estate. She was standing in a federal foreclosure waiting to happen. Beatrice and Terrence had spent years operating in the shadows, relying on Jamal's pristine military reputation to shield them from federal scrutiny. They assumed Jamal would always fix their mistakes. They assumed his honorable record would act as a permanent buffer against any real consequences. But Jamal was gone, and he had taken his shield with him to the grave. Now Beatrice was fighting tooth and nail to secure total legal ownership of a radioactive wasteland. She was completely blinded by her own ravenous greed and her desperate need to prove her superiority over me. She wanted the title of Chief Executive Officer. She wanted the deed to the primary estate. She wanted the absolute power to dictate the family wealth. She was so obsessed with taking everything away from the dark-skinned outsider that she never once stopped to actually audit the assets she was stealing. Every hostile email she sent demanding access to the accounts, every forged document she slammed on my lawyer's desk, every smug smile she directed at me across a conference table was just her aggressively begging for the privilege of assuming millions in federal debt. She was actively fighting to put her own neck on the chopping block. She was demanding the rope we planned to hang her with. I sat at my desk drinking my coffee and staring at the confirmation of their impending doom. As a financial strategist, I am paid handsomely to spot liabilities before they detonate and neutralize them. Looking at the forensic reports, I realized the sheer magnitude of the devastation approaching Beatrice. The poisoned chalice was brimming to the top, and she was demanding to drink it down to the very last drop. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Pity is reserved for victims of circumstance. Beatrice and Terrence were the arrogant architects of their own destruction. They had stolen from my husband, they had defrauded the federal government, and they had treated me like disposable trash simply because I refused to bow to their toxic hierarchy. I closed the forensic accounting files and securely wiped my browser history. The trap was fully constructed and the bait had been taken. All that remained was for Beatrice to legally bind herself to the explosive charge. I sat across from Elias in his dimly lit conference room. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m, but neither of us felt the fatigue. The heavy mahogany table was covered in drafts, legal precedents, and corporate statutes. We were entirely focused on the digital document glowing on his primary monitor. This was not a standard transfer of assets. This was a highly weaponized legal contract. Elias typed rapidly, his eyes darting between my handwritten notes and the formal legal template. He was a brilliant corporate attorney, but even he was moving with extreme caution. We had to construct the document perfectly. If the trap looked too obvious, Beatrice's newly retained counsel might actually read the fine print and pull her back from the ledge. The poison had to be completely undetectable, masked by the intoxicating scent of absolute power. I leaned forward and tapped the glass of the monitor. Right there, I instructed, pointing to the third paragraph of the transfer agreement. We need to strengthen the language regarding the holding accounts. Her lawyer is going to look for standard succession clauses. We give them exactly what they expect, but we embed a comprehensive assumption of liability clause directly beneath the transfer of the corporate tax identification number. Elias highlighted the text and began rewriting the clause. You want to use an absolute indemnification structure, he confirmed. We explicitly state that the assuming party takes the entity fully as is. But we need to go deeper than standard commercial liability. If the Department of Defense is preparing federal indictments, we need to make sure you are legally severed from any historical actions taken by the executive board. I nodded. We use her own arrogant narrative against her. Beatrice stormed into your office claiming Jamal wanted her to have total control. She produced that forged codicil to prove it. So we weave that exact sentiment into the transfer. We state that in accordance with her aggressive demands to assume the legacy of the logistics company, she voluntarily and knowingly accepts 100% of all financial obligations, tax burdens, federal compliance liabilities, and pending legal actions. Elias stopped typing and looked at me. The glow of the monitor cast sharp shadows across his face. Kendra, if we phrase it this way, she is not just taking on the corporate debt. She is legally volunteering to stand in the direct line of fire for the federal embezzlement charges. When the government seizes the assets, they will look at this document. This contract explicitly identifies Beatrice as the sole authorized representative responsible for the historical ledger. That is exactly the point, Elias. I said, my voice devoid of any hesitation. She and Terrence committed the fraud. They drained the accounts. They broke federal law. Jamal spent his final days ensuring my name was scrubbed from those specific toxic ledgers. This document is simply the final seal on the vault door. Once she signs this, she cannot claim ignorance. She cannot claim she was just a passive beneficiary. She is demanding to be the chief executive officer. Let us give her the full legal weight of the crown. Elias turned back to the keyboard. His fingers flew across the keys, locking the trap into place. He drafted a specific severance clause that formally removed me from any and all association with the logistics company and the primary estate. He included a strict non-disparagement clause tied to a massive financial penalty just to make the document look like a standard bitter corporate divorce. That was the bait. Beatrice's lawyer would spend all his time negotiating the non-disparagement penalty, completely ignoring the radioactive waste dump hidden in the liability assumption clauses. We spent another 3 hours refining every single sentence. We anticipated every potential objection her legal team might raise, and we built invisible trapdoors around them. We ensured that the transfer of the primary estate was inextricably linked to the corporate tax liabilities. Beatrice could not take the mansion without taking the federal tax liens attached to it. The assets and the debts were fused together into a single, unbreakable legal entity. By 5 a.m, the document was flawless. It was 60 pages of dense, impenetrable corporate legalese designed to look like a complete and total surrender on my part. To an arrogant reader, it looked like the grieving widow had finally capitulated to the demands of the true family. But to a forensic accountant, it was a self-executing financial death warrant. Elias hit the print command. The heavy commercial laser printer in the corner of the room hummed to life. We sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic sound of the pages sliding into the tray. It sounded like the steady ticking of a bomb. Elias gathered the thick stack of warm paper and tapped it against the mahogany table to align the edges. He placed the heavy document inside a thick black leather portfolio. He looked down at the portfolio and then up at me. His expression was a mixture of deep respect and quiet awe. I have drafted hundreds of corporate acquisitions in my career, Elias said softly. I have executed hostile takeovers and aggressive liquidations, but I have never seen a financial snare constructed with this level of lethal precision. Beatrice thinks she is walking into a courtroom tomorrow to claim her prize. She has no idea she is walking onto a federal execution block. I stood up and smoothed the lines of my tailored suit. I picked up my briefcase and looked at the black portfolio resting on the table. Jamal was an honorable man. He fought his enemies face to face on the battlefield. I am a financial strategist. I do not fight on battlefields. I let my enemies build their own gallows, and then I politely hand them the rope. The exits were completely sealed. The documents were finalized. The offshore trust was fully funded and untraceable. All that remained was the final courtroom performance. I thanked Elias for his relentless work and walked out of the conference room into the quiet pre-dawn light of the city. The air felt crisp and entirely clear. The trap was perfectly set. Now it was time to let the vultures feast. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Probate Court swung open with a resounding thud that echoed across the polished marble floors. I was already seated at the petitioner table next to Elias. My posture was perfectly straight, my breathing slow and measured. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, free of any ostentatious branding or theatrical mourning accessories. I did not need to dress like a widow in mourning because my grief was private and sacred. It did not belong in this room. This room was strictly for business, and the business of the day was absolute ruin. The disruption at the entrance signaled the arrival of the opposition. Beatrice marched down the center aisle of the courtroom like she was descending a grand staircase at a high society gala. She was draped in aggressive designer mourning wear. A wide-brimmed black hat veiled her face in dramatic black lace. A custom-tailored black trench coat swept behind her, brushing the backs of the wooden pews. It was a flawless performance of a devastated matriarch masking the ravenous greed burning underneath. Terrence strutted right behind her. He wore a brand-new three-piece midnight blue suit that I immediately recognized as a recent charge on the logistics company corporate card. He adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, looking around the courtroom not with solemnity, but with the eager anticipation of a man waiting to collect a massive lottery check. And then there was Chloe. She clutched a matte black crocodile skin handbag that cost more than a standard mortgage down payment. She walked with a deliberate, exaggerated sway, making sure her expensive heels clicked loudly against the marble. The three of them did not look like a family arriving to settle the estate of a beloved son and brother. They looked like a victorious cartel arriving to claim their captured territory. They bypassed the standard seating and took their places in the front row of the gallery directly behind their attorney Donald. The sheer volume of their whispers was completely intentional. They wanted me to hear them. They wanted to ensure I felt the absolute weight of their triumph. "I told you she would fold," Chloe Stage whispered, leaning over the wooden partition to speak to Terrence. Her voice carried across the silent courtroom, slicing through the quiet murmurs of the court clerks. She finally learned her place. She knows she cannot fight real generational wealth. I did not turn around. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy black leather portfolio resting perfectly aligned on the table between Elias and me. My hands were folded neatly in my lap. Chloe thought my silence was the ultimate sign of submission. She genuinely believed that her white entitlement and Beatrice's relentless bullying had finally broken my spirit. She had absolutely no idea that I was looking at her designer handbag and calculating the exact velocity at which the federal government would repossess it. Elias shifted slightly in his chair. He glanced at me out of the corner of his eye. Even after pulling an all-night session to draft the lethal transfer documents, he looked impeccably sharp. I could see the faint trace of a smile threatening to break his professional composure. He was marveling at my absolute stillness. In his years of practicing corporate law, he had seen grown men throw violent tantrums over a fraction of the assets currently at stake. Yet here I sat, perfectly relaxed, preparing to voluntarily hand over a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Donald, their overly confident attorney, approached our table. He buttoned his suit jacket and extended a hand toward Elias, offering a deeply condescending smile. "I am glad we could come to a sensible agreement without dragging this through a messy public trial," Elias Donald said, his tone dripping with patronizing approval. "Your client made the right choice. Fighting Beatrice on this would have been financially ruinous for her. It is always better to step aside gracefully." Elias stood up and accepted the handshake. His grip was firm, his expression completely unreadable. "We are simply following the most efficient legal path," Donald Elias replied smoothly. "Kendra wants to ensure that Beatrice receives exactly what she demanded. We have prepared the final transfer documents per your request." Donald nodded, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. He returned to his table, leaning back and whispering something to Beatrice that made her smile widen beneath her black lace veil. I could feel her gaze burning into the back of my head. She was waiting for me to break. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing my shoulders slump. She wanted me to look back at her with tears of defeat. I decided to give her a small piece of exactly what she wanted. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. I did not glare. I did not scowl. I offered her a very slight, polite nod of acknowledgement. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice looked completely unnerved. My absolute calm did not compute with her narrative, but her monumental ego was a runaway train. She instantly overrode her instincts and interpreted my polite nod as a white flag of surrender. She lifted her chin higher, her chest swelling with ultimate victory. She had conquered the dark-skinned outsider. She had taken back her son's empire. The heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swung open. The bailiff stepped into the room, his voice booming across the polished marble. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Vance Carter." The entire courtroom stood in unison. The rustle of expensive fabric echoed through the gallery as Beatrice Terrence and Chloe rose to their feet. I stood up smoothly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I looked down at the black leather portfolio one last time. The documents inside were a masterpiece of legal destruction. The exits were sealed. The explosive charges were wired. The judge took his seat at the elevated bench, looking out over the courtroom with sharp, no-nonsense eyes. The final act of this war was officially underway. Judge Vance Carter adjusted his microphone and let his gavel strike the sounding block with a single sharp crack that instantly commanded absolute silence. The ambient murmurs in the gallery vanished. The rustling of expensive fabric ceased. Every eye in the room locked onto the elevated bench. In the matter of the estate of the late Colonel Jamal Carter, the judge began, his voice carrying a deep, resonant authority that demanded respect. "We are gathered today to review the probate filings, the distribution of assets, and a newly submitted codicil that purports to radically alter the original estate plan." Donald popped up from his chair with the eager energy of a man who believed he was holding a royal flush. He buttoned his suit jacket and approached the podium. "Your Honor," Donald stated, puffing out his chest, "we have submitted a handwritten document executed by the deceased in his final days. This profound final testament clearly outlines his dying wish to return his primary estate and his multi-million-dollar military logistics corporation to his mother Beatrice. We ask the court to recognize this document and immediately transfer full ownership and all operating authority to my client." Judge Carter picked up the photocopy of the hotel's stationery. He held it up to the light, adjusting his reading glasses. His expression was one of profound judicial skepticism. He looked at the sloppy blue ink, the lack of a proper notary seal, and the highly questionable signature at the bottom of the page. He let out a slow, heavy sigh that echoed through the courtroom speakers. "Counselor," the judge said, addressing Donald with a tone bordering on reprimand, "you have brought me a paragraph scribbled on the back of hotel letterhead. You are asking this court to override an ironclad 50-page estate plan drafted by a prestigious corporate firm based entirely on this highly irregular piece of paper." Donald stood his ground, pointing a dramatic finger toward Beatrice. "Your Honor, a mother's bond with her son transcends formal paperwork. We have witnesses who can testify to his state of mind. He wanted to correct a grave mistake. He wanted his bloodline to secure his generational wealth." Judge Carter did not look impressed. He dropped the paper back onto his desk and turned his sharp gaze toward our table. He looked past Elias and focused directly on me. His eyes were observant, calculating, and filled with a silent warning. He knew exactly what this looked like. It looked like a grieving widow being financially bullied by her aggressive in-laws. "Mr. Elias," the judge said, addressing my attorney, "I assume you have prepared a mountain of hostile injunctions against this document. I assume you are ready to file motions for fraud, forgery, and undue influence. I am fully prepared to hear your arguments right now." The courtroom held its collective breath. Beatrice leaned forward in her seat, her black lace veil trembling slightly as she anticipated the brutal legal war she had threatened to counter with a media smear campaign. Terrence gripped the wooden partition, his knuckles turning lighter as he braced for impact. Chloe pulled out her phone, holding it low under the pew, likely preparing to text her friends about the dramatic courtroom battle. Elias stood up slowly. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket and picked up the heavy black leather portfolio from our table. He did not look angry, he did not look defensive. He looked like a man holding the launch codes to a nuclear weapon. "Your Honor." Elias spoke, his voice perfectly measured and devoid of any panic. "The defense has indeed reviewed the document submitted by opposing counsel. However, my client has instructed me not to file any injunctions. She has requested the opportunity to address the court directly regarding her position on this matter and her intentions for the primary estate." A wave of confused whispers rippled through the gallery. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by this deviation from standard legal combat. He nodded slowly. "Mrs. Carter, you may address the court." I stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed the lines of my charcoal gray suit and stepped out from behind the heavy wooden table. I walked to the center podium, standing perfectly straight with my shoulders pulled back. I did not carry any tissues. I did not tremble. I projected the absolute chilling authority of a senior financial strategist who had thoroughly calculated the math of the battlefield. I looked up at Judge Carter, meeting his gaze with absolute clarity. Then I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Beatrice. Beatrice was staring at me with a mixture of intense anticipation and vicious hunger. She was waiting for me to beg. She was waiting for me to cite my decade of marriage to her son, my loyalty, and my grief. She wanted to savor the taste of my desperation before she ripped my empire away. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I wanted to burn this exact moment into her memory. I wanted her to remember the precise second she believed she had conquered me. "I contest nothing." "Your Honor," I stated. My voice rang out clear, crisp, and echoing off the marble walls. "Let her have it all." The courtroom reacted as if I had just dropped a live grenade on the floor. A loud collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Chloe actually shrieked, a short burst of pure triumphant shock. Terrence threw his hands up in the air, whispering a loud victory chant to himself. Donald looked completely bewildered, his jaw dropping slightly as his entire litigation strategy evaporated into thin air. Judge Carter struck his gavel twice to silence the sudden eruption of noise. He leaned far over his bench, staring down at me with deep, intense scrutiny. He needed to ensure I was not being coerced or suffering from a psychological break. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, his voice grave and cautious. "Do you fully understand the magnitude of the statement you just made on the official court record? You are voluntarily surrendering your legal spousal claim to a highly lucrative government logistics corporation and a multi-million-dollar primary estate. Are you stating for the record that you wish to yield total unconditional ownership of these entities to your mother-in-law?" I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice. Her smile was so massive it looked painful. She was practically vibrating with the intoxicating rush of absolute power. She thought my spirit was completely broken. "I understand exactly what I am surrendering, Your Honor," I replied, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "If my mother-in-law insists that it is her absolute right to take over the logistics corporation, then she may have it. If she demands the deed to the primary estate, she may have it. I withdraw all claims to those specific assets. I want the court to grant her full, total, and unshared ownership immediately. I want her name and her name alone on the final dotted line." Beatrice could no longer contain herself. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, pressing her manicured hand to her chest. She turned to Terrence and whispered that the dark-skinned outsider finally understood how real power worked. Judge Carter studied me for a long moment. He saw the cold, absolute certainty in my posture. He realized I was not a victim buckling under pressure. He realized I was executing a highly specific, legally binding maneuver. "Very well," he said slowly, sitting back in his high leather chair. "If the petitioner formally surrenders her claim, We will proceed with the immediate transfer of the requested assets. Counsel present the transfer documents for signatures. Elias stepped forward, opening the heavy black leather portfolio. He pulled out the 60 pages of dense, impenetrable corporate legalese we had drafted at 2 in the morning. He walked across the aisle and placed the lethal document directly in front of Donald and Beatrice. The paper hit the table with a soft, heavy thud. The trap was officially sprung. Donald pulled the thick stack of paper toward him with a theatrical display of legal diligence. He flipped through the heavy stock pages, his eyes scanning the headers with practiced speed. He was looking for the obvious traps, the standard hurdles a grieving spouse might throw into a settlement. When he reached page 42, he stopped. A smug, self-satisfied grin spread across his face. He had found the strict non-disparagement clause Elias and I had heavily engineered to act as a brightly colored decoy. Donald leaned in and whispered to Beatrice, pointing at the paragraph. I watched his lips move, assuring her that this was simply a bitter widow trying to save face by threatening financial penalties for public insults. He told her it was standard petty behavior from a woman who knew she had lost. Because Donald was so focused on validating his own ego by spotting the decoy, he completely breezed past Section 4, Paragraph B. He did not read the dense, impenetrable corporate legalese that legally fused the primary estate deed directly to the logistics company federal tax identification number. He did not notice the absolute assumption of all historical, current, and future corporate liabilities. His arrogance blinded him to the radioactive waste dump hidden in plain sight. He gave Beatrice a confident nod, signaling that the documents were safe to sign. Beatrice did not even bother to read the pages herself. Her patience for legal formalities had completely evaporated the moment I stood at the podium and surrendered. She snatched the expensive gold-plated fountain pen directly from Donald's hand. The sheer hunger radiating from her posture was terrifying to witness, but deeply satisfying to my strategic mind. She looked across the aisle at me one last time before making her mark. It was a look of pure, unadulterated conquest. She truly believed she had successfully bullied a highly educated, self-made, dark-skinned woman into absolute submission. She thought my silence was the ultimate manifestation of my weakness. She pressed the nib of the pen against the first signature line with aggressive force. The sharp scratching sound of ink bleeding into paper echoed through the cavernous marble courtroom. Signature 1 officially transferred the deed of the primary estate. By aggressively signing that specific line, she legally volunteered her own name to be the very first asset liquidated by the Internal Revenue Service. She was claiming a mansion that would soon be surrounded by federal agents holding foreclosure notices. She flipped the page with a sharp snap of her wrist. Signature 2 granted her absolute unfettered access to the primary corporate holding accounts. With that single stroke, she formally chained herself to $6.2 million in unpaid federal tax liens. She was claiming ownership of a bank vault that was already actively burning to the ground, transferring the crippling debt from the corporate entity directly onto her own personal Social Security number. She moved to the final section. Signature 3 was the absolute crown jewel of the trap. She formally appointed herself the sole chief executive officer and primary stakeholder of the military logistics company. With a massive, dramatic flourish of blue ink, Beatrice explicitly identified herself to the waiting federal prosecutors as the singular prime target for the pending Department of Defense embezzlement indictments. She was putting her own head willingly into the guillotine, and she was smiling while she did it. In the gallery directly behind the defense table, Chloe abandoned all remaining courtroom decorum. She actually clapped her hands together, creating a sharp, rapid sound of gleeful white entitlement that bounced off the wooden pews. The court bailiff shot her a harsh warning glare, but Chloe simply covered her mouth, vibrating with unrestrained excitement. She leaned over the wooden partition and slapped Terrence on the shoulder. She loudly whispered about calling their high-end interior decorator the exact second they left the courthouse to rip out my custom emerald accents and replace them with something more aligned with her refined tastes. Terrence nodded vigorously, crossing his arms and leaning back in his seat. He was already visualizing the imported sports cars and luxury watches he planned to buy with the corporate funds by the end of the week. They were throwing a massive celebration on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. They were so intoxicated by the illusion of their stolen generational wealth that they could not feel the icy water already pooling around their ankles. Beside me, Elias remained perfectly still. He was a master of his craft, and he played his role flawlessly. He maintained a posture of rigid professional defeat. He kept his eyes lowered to our table, allowing Donald and Beatrice to bask in their perceived dominance. But underneath the table, where no one else could see, Elias tapped his index finger against his knee in a steady, rhythmic cadence. It was the only tell he allowed himself. We were counting down the final seconds of Beatrice's freedom. Beatrice finished the final page. She signed her name with sweeping, aggressive strokes, underlining it twice for maximum visual impact. She capped the pen with a loud click and pushed the thick stack of papers back toward her attorney. She did not look relieved that the legal battle was over. She looked utterly ravenous, eager to leave the building and immediately begin spending money that did not exist. By signing those documents, she had officially scrubbed Jamal's honorable name from the toxic entity and replaced it with her own. Donald gathered the 60 pages of signed documents. He tapped them against the wooden table to align the edges, mirroring the exact motion Elias had made in our war room at 2 a.m. Donald handed the heavy black leather portfolio to the approaching bailiff, giving Beatrice one final congratulatory nod. The bailiff took the documents and walked them up the wooden steps, placing them directly on Judge Carter's elevated bench. The physical transfer of the paperwork was complete. The ink was already drying on the page. The bait had been swallowed whole, and the steel jaws of the trap had officially snapped shut around Beatrice's neck. Everything she had demanded was now legally, unequivocally hers. Judge Vance Carter received the thick stack of papers from the bailiff. He adjusted his reading glasses, his face an unreadable mask of judicial authority. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Beside me, Elias sat with his hands neatly folded on the table, projecting the image of a defeated attorney. But I could feel the microscopic shift in his energy. We were at the summit of the roller coaster, hanging suspended just before the massive drop. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, maintaining my perfect posture. In the periphery of my vision, I could see Beatrice adjusting the black lace veil of her hat. She was already mentally spending money that did not exist. Terrence was leaning over the wooden partition behind her, whispering something to Chloe that made her giggle loudly. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they completely missed the subtle change in the atmosphere at the elevated bench. Judge Carter did not just glance at the signature pages. He is a meticulous jurist known for his sharp attention to detail. He flipped back to section 4. His eyes tracked back and forth across the dense paragraphs Elias and I had drafted at 2 a.m. I watched his brow furrow slightly. He read the absolute indemnification structure. He read the explicit transfer of the corporate tax identification number. He read the uncompromising language regarding the assumption of all historical, current, and future liabilities. He looked up from the pages and stared at Donald. Donald was busy snapping the clasps of his expensive briefcase closed, completely oblivious to the judicial scrutiny burning into the side of his head. Donald had failed his client spectacularly, prioritizing his own ego over basic legal diligence. He had skimmed the contract, looking for standard non-disparagement clauses, and completely missed the radioactive waste dump hidden in plain sight. Judge Carter picked up his heavy brass official seal. He pressed it into the black ink pad. He brought it down on the final page of the transfer agreement with a resounding crack that echoed off the marble walls. He signed his own name across the bottom line with quick, decisive strokes. The transfer was officially executed. The documents were permanently entered into the court record. There was absolutely no undoing what had just been done. Beatrice was now the sole legal owner of the primary estate and the Military Logistics Corporation. She owned every single asset and every single drop of toxic debt. Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. She turned to look at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious triumph. She was waiting for me to break down. She wanted me to weep for the empire she thought she had just stolen. I simply blinked, offering her nothing but cold, empty silence. Normally, this would be the moment the judge struck his gavel and dismissed the session. Beatrice grabbed her designer handbag, ready to march out of the courtroom and immediately drive to the estate to begin her hostile occupation. Chloe was already standing up, pulling her keys from her purse. Terrence was practically dancing in his expensive shoes. But Judge Carter did not reach for his gavel. He slowly closed the heavy manila folder containing the newly stamped documents. He folded his hands on top of the file. He lowered his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose. The ambient noise in the gallery instantly died. The silence became thick, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of dead silence that precedes a massive natural disaster. Counselor Judge Carter said, his deep voice slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. He was looking directly at Donald. Donald froze, his hand still resting on the handle of his briefcase. "Yes, Your Honor," Donald replied, his voice suddenly lacking its previous patronizing confidence. Judge Carter shifted his piercing gaze away from the attorney and locked eyes directly with my mother-in-law. Beatrice stopped moving. Her triumphant smile froze awkwardly on her face. She suddenly looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an approaching freight train. The air in the room grew instantly colder. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, "I want to ensure for the official court record that you fully comprehend the legal gravity of the documents you have just executed." Beatrice blinked, clearly confused by the deviation from standard procedure. She gripped her handbag tighter, her knuckles turning slightly lighter against the dark leather. "I understand perfectly well, Your Honor," she replied, trying to inject her usual aristocratic arrogance back into her tone. "I am reclaiming my family legacy. I am taking back what rightfully belongs to the bloodline." Judge Carter did not break eye contact. He leaned forward over the elevated bench, a gesture of absolute judicial authority. "Are you fully aware, Mrs. Carter, that by legally assuming sole ownership and operational control of these specific entities, you are also voluntarily accepting sole liability for the financial and legal burdens explicitly attached to them?" Donald stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Your Honor, my client understands she is taking on the standard operational debts of the logistics company. We are prepared to manage the basic corporate transitions and payroll obligations. There is no need for concern." "I am not talking about standard operational debts," Counselor Judge Carter snapped, silencing Donald instantly. "I am looking at a self-executing assumption of liability clause that is as airtight as a bank vault. You allowed your client to sign a document without apparently reading the addendums." The judge picked up the file again and opened it, reading directly from the trap Elias and I had meticulously planted. "You have just signed a binding federal document stating you knowingly and willingly accept 100% of all historical liabilities associated with this corporate tax identification number. That is not standard debt, Mrs. Carter. That is a legal surrender to aggressive federal action." Beatrice looked at Donald, panic finally beginning to crack through her flawless makeup. "Donald, what is he talking about?" she hissed, her voice losing all its polished refinement. Donald rushed to the podium, his face draining of color. "Your Honor, we assumed those were standard indemnification templates protecting the widow from basic vendor disputes. We did not agree to anything beyond routine corporate succession." "You agreed to everything," Judge Carter corrected, sharply closing the file with a heavy thud. "You signed an absolute assumption of risk. The ink is dry and the seal is stamped." I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured. Beside me, Elias finally let a small, genuine smile touch the corners of his mouth. The trap had been sprung. The steel jaws were locked tight. I watched Beatrice realize that the crown she had fought so desperately to steal was actually made of razor wire. She was standing at the absolute peak of her arrogant delusion, completely unaware that gravity was about to take over. Judge Carter pulled the transfer document closer to his microphone. He adjusted his glasses one final time before his voice resonated with the kind of absolute finality that shatters lives permanently. "Let me read the exact addendum you just authorized, Mrs. Carter," he announced, his tone echoing off the high marble walls of the courtroom. Section 4, paragraph C explicitly outlines the nature of the burden you have claimed. It reads as follows. "By signing these documents, you have accepted sole liability for the $6.2 million in federal tax liens and the pending Department of Defense embezzlement indictments attached to these entities. The silence that followed those words was not just quiet. It was a complete, absolute vacuum of sound. It was the terrifying stillness of all oxygen being sucked out of the room right before a massive explosion. $6.2 million. The number hung in the air, hovering directly over Beatrice's head like an executioner's blade. I watched the blood drain entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. The smug, victorious matriarch who had marched into this courtroom looking to conquer an empire vanished instantly. In her place sat a terrified elderly woman who had just legally volunteered to be crushed under the full weight of the United States federal government. Donald completely lost whatever remained of his professional composure. He lunged forward, reaching his hands out toward the elevated bench, as if he could physically grab the stamped documents and tear them to shreds. "Your Honor, I object!" Donald shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. I moved to strike the signatures from the record immediately. My client was deliberately deceived. Opposing counsel hid these liabilities. This was an unconscionable failure to disclose material facts during a corporate transfer. We retract the authorization. We officially retract the signatures. Judge Carter did not even blink. He looked down at the frantic attorney with a mixture of judicial disgust and absolute zero tolerance. You cannot retract a signed, sealed, and heavily negotiated corporate transfer simply because you failed to do your job. Counselor Judge Carter fired back, his voice booming through the speakers. Do not stand in my courtroom and claim failure to disclose. The liability assumption clauses span 3 entire pages of this contract. They are not hidden in the margins. They are explicitly detailed in bold text. You chose not to read them because you were too busy rushing to secure the assets for your client. But, Your Honor, Donald pleaded, his hands shaking visibly as he gripped the edge of the wooden podium. My client had no knowledge of any Department of Defense indictments. She cannot be held responsible for criminal investigations she was unaware of. She is the one who demanded total operational control of the military logistics company, Judge Carter countered, leaning forward. She presented a handwritten codicil to this court, claiming it was her absolute right to take over the primary holding accounts. When you execute a hostile takeover of a corporate entity and sign a document stating you accept the business as is, you inherit the entire ledger. The assets, the debts, the tax liens, and the federal scrutiny. The ink is dry, the seal is stamped. These documents are legally binding, and they will not be overturned in this court. Total chaos finally erupted in the gallery. Chloe leaped up from her wooden pew, clutching her expensive crocodile skin handbag to her chest like a life preserver. What does he mean, tax liens? She shrieked, turning her furious gaze toward her husband. Terrence, what does he mean, Department of Defense indictments? We just moved into the estate. We just ordered custom furniture. Terrence looked like he was about to vomit. His custom midnight blue suit suddenly seemed to suffocate him. He stumbled backward, gripping the wooden partition for support. He knew exactly what the Department of Defense indictments meant because he was the one who had generated the phantom supply chain routes. He was the one who had falsified the government invoices to cover his massive gambling debts. He thought his mother was stepping up to shield him from the fallout. He never imagined she would accidentally legally bind herself as the primary target for the federal prosecutors. Mom, Terrence choked out, his voice trembling with raw, unadulterated fear. Mom, what did you just sign? Tell him to cancel it. Tell the judge you do not want the company anymore. Beatrice could not answer him. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she gripped the edges of the defense table. She slowly turned her head and looked across the aisle at me. Her black lace veil trembled as her eyes locked onto mine. The sheer magnitude of my trap had finally pierced through her monumental ego. She realized that every single thing I had done over the past few weeks, from handing over the keys in the church lobby to silently tolerating Chloe's social media eviction, was completely intentional. I had not surrendered out of weakness. I had stepped aside to give them a clear, unobstructed path directly into a federal minefield. You, Beatrice hissed, her voice rattling with venom and absolute terror. You set us up. You knew the company was being audited. You knew the government was coming for the accounts. You deliberately handed me a dying business. I remained perfectly seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked back at her with the cold, calculating calmness she had always mistaken for submission. I did not set you up. Beatrice, I replied, my voice perfectly steady, carrying across the short distance between our tables. I simply gave you exactly what you asked for. You demanded Jamal's legacy. You demanded the primary estate and the logistics company. You brought a forged piece of hotel stationery into a law firm and threatened to destroy my professional reputation if I did not surrender. I surrendered. I gave you the crown you wanted so desperately. It is not my fault you never bothered to check if the crown was laced with poison before you put it on your head. Donald turned to Beatrice, his face shining with nervous sweat. Beatrice, we need to file an emergency appeal, he stammered, packing his briefcase with erratic, frantic movements. We need to claim you are under severe emotional duress. We need to hire federal defense counsel immediately. They are going to freeze your personal bank accounts by the end of the day. At the mention of her personal bank accounts, Beatrice let out a sharp, guttural cry. The reality of the $6.2 million tax lien was fully crystallizing. The Internal Revenue Service does not just seize corporate assets. When you assume sole liability for a corporate entity, they come after your personal wealth to satisfy the debt. They would take her luxury vehicles. They would garnish her high society investments. They would seize the very estate Chloe was currently standing inside. The bailiff stepped forward, positioning himself between the defense table and the elevated bench, clearly anticipating that Beatrice or Terence might try to physically rush the judge. But there was no physical fight left in them. There was only the devastating, crushing weight of absolute financial ruin. Judge Carter struck his gavel one final time. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot, terminating any further debate. The transfer is complete, and entered into the public record, the judge announced, his tone signaling the absolute end of the proceedings. Mrs. Carter, you are now the sole legal owner and liable party of the Logistics Corporation and the primary estate. May heaven help you with the federal authorities. This court is adjourned. The echo of the gavel striking the wooden block had not even faded from the air when Beatrice absolutely lost her mind. The reality of the $6.2 million tax lien and the pending federal indictments finally shattered her meticulously crafted high society facade. She lunged forward, hitting the heavy wooden defense table with both hands so hard the impact vibrated across the floorboards. No, she screamed, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic hysteria that made the court clerks jump in their seats. You cannot do this. She is the widow. You cannot let her walk away. Beatrice pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. Her black lace veil was knocked askew, revealing eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She turned her wild gaze back up to the elevated bench, refusing to let the judge leave the room. She was married to my son for a decade, Beatrice shouted desperately, trying to drag me down into the crater she had just dug for herself. She is a senior financial strategist. She handles all the money. If there is corporate tax fraud, she is the one who orchestrated it. You cannot let her walk out of this courtroom with her hands clean while I take the fall. Make her pay the debt. She is legally responsible for her husband's corporate liabilities. Judge Carter, who had been preparing to stand and exit his bench, froze. He looked down at Beatrice with a mixture of profound judicial pity and severe irritation. He did not appreciate people screaming baseless accusations in his courtroom after a session was officially closed. I did not react to her screaming. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against her frantic deflections. I simply unclasped the brushed metal locks on my briefcase. I reached inside and withdrew a thick, heavy binder bound in pristine white leather. The front cover was stamped with the raised gold seal of one of the most ruthless and respected independent forensic accounting firms on the eastern seaboard. I walked smoothly toward the center podium. Elias remained seated at our table, a quiet, observant witness to my final execution of the strategy. Your Honor, I said, my voice projecting a calm, absolute authority that instantly cut through Beatrice's frantic hyperventilating. If I may approach the bench to submit one final document for the official public record, I want to ensure there is absolutely no ambiguity regarding the widow's liability in this matter. Judge Carter nodded slowly, gesturing for the bailiff to take the heavy binder. He adjusted his glasses as he opened the pristine white cover. I turned my body slightly so I could address the judge while keeping my mother-in-law squarely in my peripheral vision. What you are holding, Your Honor, is a certified independent forensic audit. It was conducted over several weeks by a specialized team of former Internal Revenue Service criminal investigators. It comprehensively details the absolute financial separation of my personal estate from the Military Logistics Corporation. I made sure my voice was loud and clear enough for Terrence and Chloe to hear every single syllable from their seats in the gallery. Exactly 3 months and 2 days prior to his passing, Jamal and I executed a complete legal and financial divestment, I explained, detailing the architecture of our offshore fortress. We legally severed all commingled assets. We liquidated our legitimate shared portfolios and paid all applicable capital gains taxes up front. Jamal formally resigned as the primary guarantor for the commercial credit lines, and I officially terminated my advisory role with the corporate entity. I turned my head and looked directly into Beatrice's terrified eyes. I wanted her to hear the next part with crystal clarity. We did this because Jamal discovered the phantom supply chain routes, I said, letting the truth hit her like a physical blow. He saw the fraudulent invoices Terrence was generating. He saw you overriding the compliance team to authorize the federal payouts and funneling that capital into your personal shell companies. He knew the Department of Defense was going to bring the hammer down. His final act as my husband was building a bulletproof wall between your federal crimes and my clean assets. Beatrice staggered backward. She grabbed the edge of the defense table, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the realization washed over her. The financial loss was devastating, but the emotional blow I just delivered was fatal. Her own son had known about the fraud. Jamal had watched them steal from the government, and instead of protecting his mother and his brother, he had spent his final dying months meticulously protecting the dark-skinned woman they despised. He had actively chosen his wife over his bloodline. The audit proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that every single dollar in my possession was legitimately earned, properly taxed, and entirely isolated from the holding accounts you just eagerly claimed. I continued hammering the final nails into her coffin. Under federal law and state marital property statutes, I hold absolutely zero liability for fraudulent debts accumulated by a corporate entity that I am legally severed from. Furthermore, the transfer agreement you just aggressively signed explicitly absolves the previous estate of all pending liabilities. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the podium, maintaining my unbroken eye contact with Beatrice. "You wanted the crown, Beatrice," I said softly, allowing the perfect acoustics of the room to carry my voice to her ears. "But you were so blinded by your hatred for me that you did not realize Jamal had already vacated the castle. I am completely and legally untouchable." Judge Carter flipped through the summary pages of the forensic audit. He nodded, visibly impressed by the sheer tactical brilliance of the financial maneuvering. "This document is fully certified and notarized," the judge stated, looking down at Donald, who was currently sweating completely through his designer shirt. "It creates an ironclad severance. Mrs. Kendra Carter has absolutely no legal or financial connection to the debt your client just voluntarily assumed. The widow is entirely free and clear." In the gallery behind the defense table, Terrence let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimpering sound. He looked frantically at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, clearly calculating if he could make a run for it before the authorities arrived. Chloe was weeping openly now, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was looking at her diamond rings and her crocodile skin handbag as if they had suddenly turned into burning coals. The generational wealth she had bragged about to her thousands of social media followers was actually just a fast track to a federal indictment. Beatrice sank slowly into her chair. The fight completely drained out of her body, leaving her looking hollow and fragile. She stared at me with terrified, empty eyes. She had spent a decade trying to prove she was smarter, classier, and more powerful than me. She had used every social weapon at her disposal to break my spirit. And in the end, her relentless pursuit of my destruction was exactly what led her directly into the trap. I did not have to lift a single finger to ruin her. I just had to stand completely still and let her boundless arrogance do all the heavy lifting. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the gallery swing open with a sharp crash that echoes against the high ceilings. The murmurs in the courtroom instantly die. Footsteps, heavy and synchronized, march down the center aisle. 4 men and 2 women dressed in sharp, unremarkable dark suits cross the threshold. Gold shields catch the fluorescent light clipped to their belts and lapels. Federal agents. Terrence turns around. The color drains from his face. His pristine posture collapses as the reality of the situation breaches his arrogance. He attempts to adjust his tie, a nervous tick, but his hands tremble. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and an expression carved from granite, stops at the swinging gate separating the gallery from the defense tables. She pushes it open without asking permission. She does not look at the judge. Her eyes are locked entirely on Terrence. Terrence takes a step back, bumping into the edge of the defense table. He looks at his lawyer, demanding an intervention, but his attorney simply gathers his papers and takes a deliberate step away, severing his professional ties in real time. The lead agent speaks with absolute authority. Her voice is calm but carries across the silent room. She addresses him by his full legal name. She announces that he is being taken into federal custody. She lists the charges with rapid, practiced precision: wire fraud, corporate espionage, embezzlement of company funds exceeding $40 million, racketeering. Terrence stammers. He insists this is a misunderstanding. He claims the corporate accounts were legally structured under his management. He points toward the judge, shouting that the probate hearing just concluded, that he has legitimate rights to the estate and its subsidiaries. The agent pulls a pair of steel handcuffs from her belt. She steps into his personal space, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy. She informs him that the probate hearing was exactly what they were waiting for. They needed him to legally claim the fraudulent shell companies on the public record. By fighting for ownership of the estate, he effectively signed a legally binding confession to the federal financial crimes. He tied himself directly to the stolen funds, proving his intent to control them. Terrence opens his mouth to speak, but no words come out. The click of the handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoes through the silent room. To his left, Chloe watches the metal snap shut. Pure panic washes over her features. Survival instinct kicks in. She physically recoils from Terrence, stumbling backward until her designer heels hit the wooden railing. She throws her hands up in the air, creating as much physical distance between them as the confined space allows. Chloe raises her voice, bordering on a frantic scream. She points a trembling finger at Terrence. She declares to the agents, the judge, and the entire room that she had absolutely no idea what he was doing. She claims he kept her in the dark. She insists she is just a victim of his manipulation, that she thought his sudden influx of cash was from legitimate investments. She begs the agents not to look at her, promising she will testify against him, offering to hand over every document in his home office if they just let her walk out the door. Terrence stares at her, betrayed, the last of his pride shattering as his partner abandons him instantly. A second agent, a younger man holding a thick leather binder, separates from the group and steps directly into Chloe's path. He blocks her exit. Chloe gasps, pressing her back against the railing. She repeats her defense, her voice cracking, swearing she knew nothing about the stolen money. The second agent opens the binder. He does not raise his voice. He simply begins reading from a printed spreadsheet. He asks if she remembers her luxury vacation to the Maldives 3 months ago. He reads aloud the specific caption from her social media post, detailing her gratitude for her newfound limitless credit line. He flips the page. He lists the exact timestamps and geolocation tags of her shopping sprees in Milan and Paris, cross-referencing them perfectly with the exact dates of Terrence's offshore wire transfers. Chloe stops breathing. The agent pulls out a glossy photograph. It is a screenshot of her own video channel. In the image, she is holding up the deed to a waterfront property, bragging to her followers about outsmarting the system and securing the bag. The agent looks her dead in the eye. He informs her that flaunting stolen assets, spending money she knew was transferred through dummy corporations, and publicly documenting her complicity does not make her a victim. It makes her a material accessory to federal racketeering and grand larceny. He states that her digital footprint provided the prosecution with a flawlessly documented trail of the embezzled cash. Chloe's knees give out. A female agent catches her by the arm before she hits the floor, hauling her upright. The sound of a second pair of handcuffs clicking shut finalizes their ruin. The lead agent addresses the room one last time, officially taking custody of the prisoners. The agents turn in unison, physically directing Terrence and Chloe back up the center aisle. Terrence walks with his head hung in total defeat, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Chloe sobs hysterically, her designer makeup running down her face, screaming at her followers, the agents in the universe, for the sheer injustice of being caught. The heavy mahogany doors swing open once more, swallowing them into the hallway. The doors shut firmly behind them. The courtroom descends into a deafening, absolute silence, leaving the rightful heirs standing tall at their table, the shadow of fraud permanently lifted from their legacy. Beatrice remains frozen at the defense table. The final echo of the heavy courtroom doors shutting behind her son seals her ultimate fate. She does not scream. She does not thrash or beg like Chloe did. Instead, she simply crumbles. The rigid, imperious posture she maintained through decades of elite country club luncheons and ruthless board meetings dissolves in an instant. She sinks heavily into the leather chair, her hands trembling violently in her lap. The absolute reality of her situation materializes around her, suffocating and undeniable. The sprawling estate is gone. The fraudulent shell companies are seized. She is left with nothing but insurmountable debt, frozen accounts, and a permanently ruined name. The high society friends who once hung on her every word will now pretend she does not exist. Her golden child, the son she meticulously groomed for corporate conquest, is currently being processed into a federal holding cell. She watches her entire empire turn to dust, scattering into the sterile, unforgiving air of the courtroom. I do not offer her a parting word. Gloating is a weapon for the insecure, and I have no need for it. I simply gather my coat, turn my back on the smoldering wreckage of their lives, and walk down the center aisle. My steady footsteps are the only sound left in the cavernous room. I press my hands against the heavy wooden doors at the back of the gallery. They yield easily beneath my weight. I step out of the stifling, oppressive air of the courthouse and into the blinding brightness of the afternoon sun. The heat of the day washes over me, clean and absolute. I close my eyes for a fraction of a second, taking a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally belongs entirely to me. The weight that has been pressing down on my chest for months evaporates into the blue sky. A sleek black town car waits idling at the curb. The chauffeur catches my eye and opens the rear door with a respectful nod. I slide into the cool, quiet interior. The heavy door shuts with a solid, definitive thud, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the city streets. As the car smoothly pulls away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, I look out the tinted window at the world passing by. I am completely secure. The millions of dollars Jamal left me rest safely in protected trusts. They are clean shielded and legally untouchable. Jamal knew exactly what he was doing when he drafted those final documents. He built a fortress not just of wealth, but of impenetrable legal armor. He anticipated every vicious move his family would make. He knew their insatiable greed would blind them to the tripwires he carefully laid out in the open. His final act was a masterclass in strategy, ensuring my absolute protection, while giving them the exact tools they needed to orchestrate their own downfall. Watching the city skyline roll past the glass, I finally understand the true definition of a legacy. It is not found in brass nameplates bolted to corporate buildings. It is not found in the aggressive hoarding of capital, the manipulation of the vulnerable, or the relentless pursuit of status. A true legacy is the unshakable foundation you lay for the people you value. Jamal left a legacy of ultimate protection and profound foresight. He understood that true power does not roar. It plans. It calculates. It waits for the perfect moment to execute. I learned the most valuable lesson of my life in these past few months. There is an unparalleled, devastating power in calculated silence. When you know the absolute truth, You do not need to shout it from the rooftops. You do not need to argue with liars or justify your existence to people committed to misunderstanding you. You simply stand back. You let the arrogant sprint blindly toward their own destruction. You let them dig the pit, hand them the shovel, and patiently wait for them to jump in. People like Beatrice, Terrence, and Chloe are entirely consumed by their own toxicity. They navigate the world assuming everyone else is as corrupt and easily manipulated as they are. They mistake quiet dignity for weakness and strategic silence for ignorance. But when you master your own emotions, when you strictly refuse to engage in their chaotic, desperate games, you win every single time. You never have to compromise your integrity. You never have to dirty your hands in their mud. You just have to be patient enough and disciplined enough to let the toxic trash take itself out. The slate is clean, the past is buried, the future is mine. The profound lesson here is the devastating power of calculated silence and emotional discipline. True strength lies in stepping back when faced with toxic people who thrive on chaos. You never need to prove your truth to those committed to misunderstanding you. Instead of engaging in loud, messy arguments, focus entirely on building your own secure foundation. Let arrogant individuals dig their own graves. Protect your peace, master your reactions. And remember that the greatest victories often require no words at all. Step back from the noise, guard your peace fiercely and completely. Refuse to engage with any toxic drama.